A very, very warm welcome to everyone. And I really appreciate you joining me in this practice that has become our practice. I'll very gently talk you into the practice. Just because in many ways I like this practice and I believe this practice has a lot of very practical application in our daily life. Whether we're in conversations, having our meals, cooking, working. I'm beginning to see how it touches almost every aspect of our lives. And so we'll begin with me just talking you gently into the practice. I know that some of you have joined me from the Eckhart Tolle group, where we listen to Eckhart Tolle speak. And I always smile to myself when I Google Eckhart Tolle and mindfulness. Just because the one thing that keeps coming up is how much he dislikes the word mindfulness. Because he says it's a label that comes with certain expectations. And I do like that. Just because it's the only thing it's ever about is about aligning ourselves into this moment. And so mindfulness, meditation, they all become labels and words, which very often keep many people away. And so maybe as we embark, as we begin this segment of our day, let us release all these labels that we have. Because before this practice today, I was thinking a lot about labels and how recently I attended a workshop, and it was on shamanism. And it was fascinating just because that was another label where it applied to an ancient practice practiced by the Native American Indians and many native communities, aboriginal communities all around the world. And as I looked into these practices and understood them a little bit more, I began to see very deep connections with the practices that we do, or we be rather, as we sit together breathing like this. They observed nature. They aligned themselves with their present moment, and they continue to do so today. They observed the animals, the insects, the grass, the trees, the clouds and the eagles in the sky that flew amongst the clouds. And at every moment, were asking themselves, what is nature trying to communicate to me? What message is nature trying to convey to me? That was a profound recognition for me. Because in many ways, that's what our practice here is about. It's not just about relieving the stress that we sometimes experience. That will come. But it's about observing, noticing our thoughts, our emotions, and how they arise as a result of our physical interaction with those around us, with nature, within our jobs, and in almost every aspect of that which we have come to know as our experience. And so nothing becomes irrelevant. I know it sounds tiring, but it isn't as tiring as it sounds once we begin to observe, not through our minds, but in a more direct manner, in a more direct way, which is what we will be, which is what my voice will be guiding you towards different tools with which to anchor ourselves into this moment. Some of these experiences that we encounter, they can be very profound, and they somehow manage to change some of the beliefs that we hold. But much of what the world is communicating to us is more subtle. And that's where a practice like this comes in very handy. I know I've been speaking to some of you outside of this class about some of the pets that I have. And it occurred to me how even at the age of, at a very young age, some of these experiences changed my beliefs in very profound ways. And in many ways, this is what this practice is about. It allows us to observe our thoughts, our beliefs about almost every subject, and release those that do not serve us. Up to the age of 4, I feared dogs. I was terrified of dogs. Until my family took in a puppy. And then I saw one of my very deep-rooted beliefs about animals changing from that point. And it came through experience. I began to love dogs and care a great deal for them. And then there was another belief I never realized I had, and that was a fear of cats. Because I grew up in a family, especially a mom, who didn't really like cats very much, and told me all about cats carrying illnesses and disease, and so I was terrified of cats and never touched a cat for most of my life. And then in my 40s, my partner whom I live with somehow adopted 2 kittens, which I was very much against. And then one of these kittens it somehow must have seen me as a mother of some sorts, and it would always sleep on my shoulders and would almost behave the same way I'd imagine dogs to have behaved. The same affection, the same attention, the same wagging of tails, the same games. And then I saw another belief changing very fundamentally. And since then, cats have come to mean a great deal to me. And all of these came through experiences. I don't know if reading books about cats or reading books by cat lovers would have ever instilled or changed my belief systems. My point is simply that I saw very strong beliefs within myself transform themselves through experiences that were quite profound. They did not seem very profound at the time, but recently, over the past few days and weeks, I begin to recognize as I've been facilitating these sessions, these classes, and questioning the very nature of beliefs. And I know I've talked more than I normally do before a session like this. But my reason for doing so is just to remind myself, to remind each and every one of us here that this is what this practice can be. It's about examining our beliefs, examining our thoughts, examining the way in which we interact with the world around us, and noticing those subtle messages. The messages that you may hear, they may not be as profound as the ones that I mentioned a moment ago. They might be little things, that little argument you have with somebody, the difficulty you may find with a particular colleague, with a particular task around the house, with a job. It's about observing our interaction. Even that argument, even that person who's rude to us, or when we are rude to another person, it normally doesn't feel very good. And so we've learned something. We've learned how we would like to be treated. And we've also learned how we would like to react the next time we're put in these exact circumstances. And so something within us has changed. And so that's what mindfulness can be in its widest sense. It's where the whole world becomes our classroom, where we observe, we notice. And occasionally use the tools that we have to step outside of the thoughts to step outside of our mind and our beliefs, which almost always react in the exact same way through habit. And in the stillness of this presence, in the stillness of this awareness, we find kindness. We rest in stillness. We rest in wisdom. And as we rest in this kindness and wisdom, we might also find a new way in which to react. A moment ago we heard the sound of the bell. As we embark into this practice together, let the bell symbolize the beginning of a new segment in our day. Where we step out of all those things that we were doing 10 minutes ago, 15 minutes ago, earlier this morning, yesterday, day before. Almost see them very gently dissolving into the background as they all belonged to a different segment, the segment before the bell. And if you like, I'll ring the bell one more time, so that you can remind yourself to arrive into this new segment. Feel your body resting upon the surface underneath you. Arriving in your chairs, in your mattresses, on your mats, on your cushions. And if you can feel your bodies, if you can feel your bodies resting upon the surface underneath it, if you can feel your posture, if you can feel the temperature around you, if you can feel the relaxing within your muscles, it's not too late to begin relaxing your muscles, letting your shoulders drop. Your arms, releasing that, what strength you have been retaining within your neck, so that your head simply balances itself on the spine, the windpipe within. You begin to get a sense of your body sitting here, breathing and relatively still. It's relatively still. And the reason I mentioned the stillness of the body is because we're about to see where the mind is. Not with our eyes, of course, but notice. Maybe notice might be a more appropriate word. And so let us notice where our mind is. It might still be holding on to some of the conversations that we were having earlier. Or depending on what you've been doing earlier this morning, or the circumstances around your life over the past few days, weeks, months, perhaps even years. Each one of us will notice a different momentum within our mind. And that is another important aspect of this practice. It's one of those rare opportunities where we can still this vessel that we have been given, called the body, the physical form. It happens very rarely, doesn't it? Where we get this opportunity to simply stop, only physically, and why have we stopped our bodies? So that we can observe the movement of the mind. If any, more likely than not, yes, there is movement. Because of that momentum we were talking about. And at this point, we remind ourselves that this practice, it's not about forcing our minds to go still or silent. Depending on what school you come from in terms of these types of practices, so many of us enter into a practice like this with preconceived ideas of what meditation is or should be like. And so we see statues, yogis, Buddhas, who describe absolute stillness and silence and transcending their form and their minds into a timeless state, and then we expect to be there immediately, and we get disappointed when we don't find ourselves there because of this momentum, this movement. Maybe they're right. Maybe that's what meditation means. But our practice, let's call this the beginning, where we want to observe this movement. And it can be a very peaceful place. Just because up until this moment, if you've ever felt stressed, if you've ever felt sad, if you've ever felt even exhilaration, if you've ever felt upset, it simply means that we have points in each and every one of our lives where we begin to identify ourselves as the mind, with the mind. And this practice that we are settling into, it's about finding tools and using tools with which to step outside of the mind and into this moment that we call our present moment. And that's all my voice is going to be guiding you towards. It's what we were being when we were noticing our bodies resting upon these surfaces. It could even be what we are being right now as we observe these movements within our mind, giving ourselves often that much needed opportunity to simply rest. Shifting the identification that we once had with the mind from the mind to the state of presence, to state of awareness. Making peace with where we find ourselves at this moment. And if at this moment you're thinking about the past, then making peace with that. And if at this moment you're worrying about some event in the future, you're still doing it from this moment, and therefore making peace with this moment once again. This is called a practice. And it's called a practice because as we continue to practice, we will begin noticing space. Space appearing between ourselves, our self with a capital S, this witnessing self, this witnessing presence, and the mind, a space that will grow with practice. And as this space appears, we will begin to find the thought process very gently and very gradually slowing down. Just like a moving fan. Initially moving when the power switch is switched on. I'm sure you know what I mean, those ceiling fans or a desk fan. When its power source is switched on, it's moving at a tremendously fast speed. It almost creates an illusion that it is a large single entity capable of swallowing up almost anything in its path. It looks a lot bigger, a lot scarier. Just like the mind. in this practice, you want to switch off the fan so that the blades slow down. And that's what we're being in this practice, this process of observing, this space that we begin to create between ourselves and our mind. Perhaps in the early stages it's like turning the speed level of the fan down, maybe from 3 to 2. So it's still moving, but you're observing it, you're watching it. And then, through a little bit more practice, maybe I'm going to practice today, I'm going to practice tomorrow. Then maybe on the third day it switches to 1, speed level 1. It's still moving, there's still a power source because I'm jumping back into the process of the mind. I'm identifying with the mind over and over again, and so that powers up the mind. But then I practice a little bit more. And then I manage to turn the switch off. No more source of energy powering the fan. And that's when the fan begins to gradually slow down, but not immediately. So I still would not want to stick my fingers through the blades of the fan because the momentum is far too quick. But I'm observing it, I'm noticing it, and now that the power's been switched off, a little smile might appear on my lips, a knowing smile, one that comes with the wisdom and the understanding of being outside of that mad process. And as the blades slow down, as our thoughts slow down, the blades, the individual blades, they begin to take form, don't they? And suddenly you realize that instead of 100 different blades, like it seemed, it appeared earlier, there are only 2 or 3 little blades. And they don't look that scary anymore. A little bit like the mind, the beliefs, they very gradually turn into individual thoughts that you find out you've been repeatedly thinking. But when you begin to recognize them as individual blades, individual thoughts, a new relationship begins to arise. And then you begin to identify, your identification shifts from the blades to the gaps in between the blades. And as you become the gaps in between the blades of the fan, that is, you begin to notice how thin the blades are. You begin to notice yourself as the space underneath the blades and the space above the blades, in addition to the space in between the blades. And then the thoughts, the mind, the form of the mind begins to regain some realistic perspective. It begins to look so much smaller than it once did as you become the space around the room, which somehow joins with the space outside of the room, which somehow joins together with the space outside of the building. And then you become the space that surrounds the streets and the islands and the continents and the planet, and then the space around the planet. There's just more and more and more space. And as you look back at the fan, as you look back at the mind, the solutions, they've always been there. The answers. It looks so much more clearer now. I bring you to our one of our first tools, which we shall use to step into this space. See if you can ignite the skin. We only want the exposed areas of skin around the body. We're going to explore how our body interacts with the space around us. How our body, in particular our skin, because that is our doorway into this space, isn't it? I don't know which parts of your body are exposed, but for me it would be the back of my hands. My palms are facing each other, so I don't feel very much on the inside, but on the outside of my hands, of my forearm, the back of my neck, my face for sure, the ears and the scalp. Of course, your experience is going to be very unique because you're in a completely different space, a completely different room. So begin with the temperature. What's your skin telling you about the temperature? Well, the skin doesn't tell you much. But the skin begins to tell you or rather send you messages once these sensations get filtered through the mind. And so it's the mind that has learned what cool is, what warm is, what breeze or windy is, what still is. It's all been decided and learned by the mind. And so let's observe these little labels that arise. Because in itself, they're just sensations. Neither good nor bad, neither warm nor cold, neither comfortable nor uncomfortable. Simply sensations. But today we are interested in the mind and the way in which it filters these sensations. But despite our interest, we're not going to enter into dialogues with the mind. If you've ever seen those little yellow post-it notes, if you see some meaning arising that sounds a bit like too warm, then mentally we'll scribble a little note on this yellow post-it, too warm, and stick it on that sensation. And too cold and too comfortable, uncomfortable, all different notes for different sensations. Because the minute you begin to converse with the mind, the chatter begins, and soon you'll completely get lost in it. I know I do. And this is about stepping outside of, this is a practice where we step outside of all that chatter. For me, it feels quite still because my windows are closed, just to insulate us from the sounds, because obviously I'm the only one with a microphone. And so the air feels relatively still. It's almost as though there's nothing around me, even though I know intellectually there are air molecules brushing against my skin. But there is one area of the body where every single one of us here will be experiencing some movement. And that would be the tips of our nostrils. So why don't we direct our attention from the skin towards the tips of our nostrils, so that we can experience this process that we call breathing. For those of you who've observed the breath before, you might hear the mind saying, "No, not again," or something like that. And if you need to talk to the mind, sometimes you have to. I would just be saying to the mind, and I'm going to speak to your mind right now, that we're here to slow our thought process down. That this practice that we are embarking on is about slowing down the movement of the mind And most of what we feed the mind, it somehow ignites, awakens, and speeds up that momentum that we were referring to a few moments ago. Interesting things, the news, the television, those incredible conversations we sometimes have, including those less amazing conversations, they all stimulate the mind in one direction or the other. And so what we're doing right now, or rather what we are being right now, is directing the mind towards something that's quite neutral. And for most of us, the mind is such a thing. It's neither good, not interesting, and neither do we hate it, neither do we find it repulsive. And so it's one of those few things that's right there in the middle. And so the mind knows, the mind understands. We treat the mind like a separate entity in this practice. So we bring ourselves back to our breath. It's the sensations. We're going to very gently align our thoughts, our mind with the body. And the way we do that is by simply stepping outside of the mind and moving straight into the sensations that we may be experiencing at this particular moment as the air flows in and out. Those little variations, the temperature, you may have experienced your breath numerous times before, which is what your mind will be telling you. But today, there's something very unique about the temperature. Something that's never been recreated before. Something different about yourself. Something new and fresh about this interaction between the cells within the nasal passage and the air that's flowing in. And so turning this breath into the first breath, the only breath. Following the breath up your nasal passage. and bringing a sense of curiosity into that point at which the in-breath turns itself into an out-breath. Curious whether today, not only today at this moment, whether this exchange from an in-breath into an out-breath will occur instantaneously, or whether there will be a pause. And if there is a pause, is it a long one or a short one? Before the breath seems to flow downward and outward. Its temperature as it flows out. Are there any new surfaces within the nostrils that you can now experience this flowing outward? And as the breath exits through the nostrils, does it brush against the upper lip or any other surface? Comfortably following every breath as consciously as you can. Turning every moment into the only moment. Every breath into the only breath. Whether moving inward or outward. Almost riding its natural, comfortable rhythm with words such as ease, that's what we want, ease. Being, not even doing your breath, but simply being your breath. If you would like to anchor your mind a little bit deeper into the breathing, then try changing the pace of your breath. Let us very gradually begin from this point, breathing in as deeply as we can. And by this, I mean taking in as much air as you can, completely ignoring the chest, but perhaps noticing your stomach balloon, your stomach wall rising as you take in more and more and more air, reaching that point which you might believe to be your capacity, pausing for a moment and then taking in a little little bit more air before releasing it as slowly and as gently, almost as though you begin to magnify these sensations of that very slow air moving down and out through the nasal passage onto the upper lip, or wherever it is you can still reach its sensations. And you notice yourself anchoring, almost like a ship's anchor being dropped into the depths of the ocean. An anchor that seems to reach deeper and deeper and deeper into the stillness of the ocean that we call our present moment. In a moment, I'm going to ring the bell. And this time the bell's not going to close our practice or anything like that. But we're going to practice something called movement meditation. Because a short while ago we spoke about how this practice was about bringing a degree of physical stillness to our day so that we may observe the movements of the mind. But we want this practice to be practical, don't we? We want this to be a practice that we can carry with us throughout our day. And so when you hear the sound of the bell, I'd like you to see if you can bring any degree of comfort to your body. It perhaps begins right now by simply scanning through your muscles, scanning through the bones underneath, the ligaments. You could even notice your eyes, your eyelids, your eyebrows, little bits you may never have noticed before. Any part at all that might be calling out for your attention, that could use a very gentle massage or a stretch. What's your body telling you at this moment? Could it be those parts underneath you which are unused to a particular posture where you may be experiencing pins and needles? But when you do hear the sound of the bell, I'd like to invite you to align your mind with the movements and notice how movement unfolds. If you like, you can even begin by noticing how the intention arises to move. Even from this point right now, you haven't heard the bell, your body is still relatively still. But if you are physically uncomfortable, or now that you've even heard my words, there's something brewing within the mind that's called impatience. When's the bell gonna ring? When's the bell gonna ring? And that might be what the mind is saying. I can't wait to move. I can't wait to really give some form of relief to that particular part of the body. But we're enjoying this whole drama because that's what it is. It's about observing, noticing. And when the bell rings, noticing which muscles contract. Which ones expand, because they almost seem to work in opposites, don't they? For every expansion, there is a contraction. And then there are the joints, which somehow manage to find a lubrication within them, which enable them to move in the different directions that they do. You don't have to observe every single one of them, but see if you can bring a sense of fun, curiosity and interest to this part of the practice. You might like to tune into any sense of relief that your body is experiencing. And perhaps use this as an opportunity to remind ourselves how every movement that we act out during the unfolding of our day becomes an opportunity in achieving alignment. Alignment that allows us to step outside of that thought process into this space of stillness, awareness, presence, where the wisdom, the kindness, and the ease is. And now for the final bell in today's practice. With that final bell, we just remind ourselves that we didn't use any fancy tools today in our practice. We used our skin. We used our breath. We used our sense of hearing. We used our muscles and our movement. All tools that are with us at all times. And so we remind ourselves that just like a conveyor belt, the day will very gently unfold before us, like a spring flower, petal by petal. And we release the need to see the flower in full bloom, knowing that we will. But simply continue with the practice. By noticing every moment that moves in our direction, every petal that unfolds. Perhaps now with a recognition that every movement, every experience is perhaps a communication worthy of our attention.